In this video, we will show how to produce professional-looking mats with the Fletcher Matmate Systems. We will demonstrate how to cut simple single mats, size a mat board, cut multiple mats and V-grooves, and how to maintain your system and make proper adjustments when needed. The Matmate 40 has a capacity of 40 inches, while the Matmate 32 cuts 32 inches. The major components are the base, clamp, cutter, mat guide, locator blocks, riser, measuring stops, and template. 5 blades are included with the system and are found in the parts bag. They are FT05015 blades, which are appropriate for general use. Please handle the blades very carefully because they are sharp, and even dull blades can cause a severe cut. The cutter is the heart of the system and is designed for comfort for either right or left-handed users. In addition, cutting can be done by either pushing or pulling the cutter. Let's install a blade in the cutter. Remove the knurled nut, washer, and blade cover. Lay a blade over the screw and replace the blade cover, washer, and knurled nut. Before you tighten the nut, notice how it can slide back and forth. If you are right-handed and plan to push to cut, the blade should extend as shown. This is the most common technique. If you plan to cut by pulling the cutter, the blade should be moved to the other side. We will push right-handed, so the blade should extend in this direction. For normal mat thickness, the end of the blade should align with the white index line on the blade cover. Now tighten the knurled nut. Rotate the handle to a central position so the blade will not touch the tabletop when you set the cutter down. We will first check the position of the blade to be sure it cuts all the way through the mat. All mat cutting will be done with a slip sheet under the mat. Size a piece of mat board about 5 inches by 30 inches and place it on the base. Place the clamp on the base so the left edge of the clamp is at 2 inches on the scales at both ends of the base. Notice how the clamp slips into serrations in both end caps. Those serrations are 1/16 inch apart and hold the clamp in place. Position a scrap mat board on top of the slip sheet and slide it to the left until it butts against the mat guide. Set the cutter on top of the clamp with the blade to the left facing the mat guide. Place your left forefinger and thumb on the cutter tabs as shown to apply downward pressure. Press down on the cutter handle and rotate it as far as it goes toward you so the blade enters the mat. Push the cutter while keeping downward pressure on the handle and make a cut. Rotate the handle back to a central position. Check to be sure that the mat was fully cut through and the blade entered the slip sheet but did not cut through it. If the cut did not go all the way through the mat, loosen the knurled nut and slide the blade slightly farther. The purpose of the slip sheet is to prevent the blade from cutting into the base, and it assures a clean bevel edge in the mat. As you begin cutting mats, move the slip sheet from time to time to present a fresh surface for the blade. When it becomes heavily scarred, replace the slip sheet. A properly cut mat will have sharp corners without overcuts. While it takes some practice, the proper technique will be demonstrated by cutting a single mat. Start with a pre-sized mat about 9 inches by 12 inches. We will show the procedure for sizing mats shortly. This mat will have a 2-inch border on all 4 sides. Place the mat upside down and under the clamp. Slide it all the way to the left so the edge is in contact with the mat guide. Use a sharp pencil, not ink, and draw a line using the left side of the clamp as a guide. This line should extend almost the full length of the mat. Lift the clamp at the near end enough to retract the mat and rotate it 90 degrees to place a new edge against the mat guide. Repeat the pencil line for this border and continue until all 4 lines are drawn. These lines will be used to determine the start and stop positions for each cut. The rear of the cutter has two index marks about an inch apart. Position the mat against the mat guide and slide the cutter so the index mark nearest you is in line with the pencil line. Place your left finger and thumb on the tabs on the front of the cutter as before. This will help hold the cutter so it does not move when the blade is inserted. Rotate the cutter handle toward you and plunge the blade. Slide the cutter toward the other end while holding the blade fully inserted. Stop the cut when the white index line on the front of the blade cover is exactly in line with the pencil line at the far end. Rotate the handle back to a central position. The parts bag contains 3 locator blocks. One end is labeled inch, and the other end is marked for metric. Insert 2 locator blocks into the holes at the far end of the base next to the clamp. Position them so the half pin is right next to the clamp and the inch designation is up. Place the 3rd locator block at the near end of the base on the left side of the clamp, which is still at 2 inches. Now, when you lift the near end of the clamp to insert or rotate a mat, the far end of the clamp is trapped by 2 locator blocks and will not accidentally slip out of its 2-inch position. When you set the near end of the clamp back on the base, it is easy to keep it against its locator block so it will go back into the 2-inch position. The holes in the end cap are 1/4 inches apart. Now lift the clamp at the near end far enough to rotate the mat 90 degrees. Slide it against the mat guide and lower the clamp. Make the second cut as you did the first, starting with the index mark on the back aligned with the pencil line, and stop when the white index line on the blade cover reaches the far line. Do this 2 more times and remove the mat. The scrap in the middle, called fallout, should be completely separated from the mat. Examine the corners of your cuts. If the fallout was completely free, you know the corners were not undercut. A slight overcut is necessary to separate the fallout. If you overcut any of the corners excessively, it will be unsightly on the front of the mat. You can determine whether it was caused by the start or the finish of a cut. Make adjustments in where to sight the index mark or index line the next time. Also, any change in the blade position on the cutter will affect over or undercutting. The pencil lines are only a guide, so as you become more confident, you may modify the exact position of the cutter for starting and stopping cuts. When a corner is undercut, you will have to complete the cut by hand with a spare blade. The other index mark on the back and index line on the blade cover are used when you pull the cutter rather than push. If you prefer to use the Matmate system left-handed, simply turn the machine end for end, but not the clamp. The 0 end of the clamp scale will remain near you and the blade will be on the right. Hold the cutter in your left hand and place your thumb and index finger of the right hand on the tabs, and you can cut either pushing or pulling. Sizing a mat board is done with the blade cutting vertically, not on an angle. The riser, which is packaged with the cutter, is attached to the bottom of the cutter and fastened with 2 thumb screws from the parts bag. When placed on the clamp, the blade will now cut vertically. Since the blade is farther from the mat, it is necessary to readjust it in order to completely cut through the mat. Loosen the knurled nut and slide it so the end of the blade is even with the end of the blade cover. Again, you should make a test cut on a piece of scrap mat. The blade should fully cut through the mat and slightly into the slip sheet. Readjust the blade again if necessary. Measure the oversized mat board and construct pencil lines for the finished size. Normally, you can expect a mat board to be square, so you will only have to cut 2 sides to produce the size you want. Push the mat guide down so it is flush with the base and the mat board can project beyond the edge of the base. Place the clamp at any convenient position as long as both ends of the clamp are at the same scale readings. Slide the mat under the clamp and on top of the slip sheet. Move the mat so the blade is in line with one of the pencil lines. Rotate the blade into the slip sheet and make a cut all the way across the mat board and into the slip sheet at the far edge. Rotate the mat to the other pencil line and make the second cut as before. Before you start cutting beveled openings again, be sure to pull the mat guide upward above the base and remove the riser from the cutting head. It will also be necessary to reposition the blade for bevel cutting. The Matmate Systems include measuring stops which lock on top of the clamp and provide starting and stopping positions for the cutter. They are particularly helpful when a number of identical mats are to be produced. The lower measuring stop will be positioned from a reading on the scale. The upper stop will be positioned from a pencil line on the back of the mat. After deciding what the mat border dimension will be, in this case let's cut a 16 by 20 mat with 3-inch borders, set the clamp on the base at the 3-inch dimension. Slide the mat upside down under the clamp and on top of a slip sheet. Construct pencil lines on the back of a mat the same way you did to cut a single mat. Move the mat to touch the mat guide as before and down so it rests against the end cap. This is important because the scale on top of the clamp can be read directly only with respect to the lower end cap. Place a measuring stop on the clamp so its upper edge aligns with 3 inches on the scale. Insert the locking knob and turn it to lock the measuring stop in this position. This is the lower measuring stop. Position the measuring stop so its locking knob is to the left. Set the cutter on the clamp and slide it toward you so it rests against the lower measuring stop. Notice that the index mark on back of the cutter is in line with the pencil line. Rotate the blade into the mat and make a cut stopping when the upper pencil line aligns with the index line on the blade cover. Leave the cutting head in this position. Put the upper measuring stop on the clamp and slide it to rest against the upper side of the cutter. Now insert the locking knob and turn to tighten and lock the measuring stop in place. Here again, be sure the locking knob is on the left side of the scale. You can retract the blade and remove the mat. Since most mats are rectangular, not square, the upper measuring stop will have to be changed when you turn the mat 90 degrees to cut the next side. If you are cutting a number of identical mats, it is more efficient to cut all of the short borders first in all the mats. Then use the original penciled mat and set the upper measuring stop for the long mat border and proceed to cut all the mats again. Of course, you can cut all the long borders first, then the shorter ones. It makes no difference which comes first. It is not unusual to have the bottom mat border weighted or wider than the top and sides. To avoid confusion, it is important to write the border dimension for each cut on the back of the mat because the start or stop position will change on each cut. If you use the measuring stops to cut a number of identical weighted bottom mats, you may find it easier to cut just one side at a time on all mats. Double mats are very effective in highlighting a second color in the artwork and add a professional touch to your mat cutting. Double or even triple matting is easy to do on the Fletcher Matmate Systems. The important requirements are that the exposed portion of the inner mat must be precisely the same on all 4 sides, and the beveled edges of the inner and outer mat must be parallel. If these conditions are not met, it is visually obvious and detracts from the professional appearance of a mat. The procedure is simple. Size the outer or top mat to the desired length and width. Size the inner or bottom mat so each side is about 1/4 inches undersized. Mark the back of each to identify it as the outer or inner mat. In addition, write the mat border dimension on the back near the edge of all four sides of each mat. Since the opening in the finished mat is determined by the inner mat, select its borders first and note them on the back of the inner mat. It is an aesthetic choice to decide how much of the inner mat will be exposed. However, 3/16 inches or 1/4 inches are common. If you decide to expose 3/16 inches, subtract 3/16 inches from the inner mat borders to determine the outer mat borders. Write this number at the edge of all four sides of the outer mat. We will cut the outer mat first, then the inner. Set the clamp on the base to cut 1 5/16 borders. You may notice the locator blocks can only move in 1/4 inch increments. Set the clamp so you read 1 5/16 inches at the left edge of the clamp. Place the outer mat under the clamp and on top of a slip sheet. Draw pencil lines on all four sides for start and stop positions as you did for a single mat. Make one additional pencil mark on the back, which will enable you to orient the fallout after you have cut all four sides. Proceed to cut the outer mat and set its fallout aside. Apply strips of double-sided tape on the back of the outer mat just outside the opening. An ATG gun is very convenient for this step. Place the inner mat, color side down, on the outer mat and adhere it with all four sides inside the edges of the outer mat. This is important because when we cut the inner mat, it must be located from the edges of the outer mat. This guarantees the exposed inner mat will be the same on all four sides and the bevels will be parallel to one another. Turn the mats over and use double-sided tape to put the fallout back in the outer mat opening, oriented the same way it was originally. This step permits the fallout to become the slip sheet for cutting the inner mat. Place the double mats upside down under the clamp, now set at 1 1/2 inches, and against the mat guide. The slip sheet is not required because the fallout becomes a slip sheet. Draw pencil lines on all four sides and cut the inner mat in the normal way. The double fallout will be freed and can be discarded. You now have produced an attractive double mat. If you want a triple mat, both the inner mats must be sized smaller than the outer one. Keep in mind the opening of the innermost mat will be the exact opening around the artwork. A V-groove in the face of the mat also adds a distinctive appearance. It is easy to cut V-grooves with the Matmate, but as with all mat cutters, the machine must be in proper adjustment. It is especially important that the clamp is perfectly parallel to the mat guide. This is frequently called square, which is a misnomer, but is the word commonly used. If your machine is not properly adjusted, it will become immediately obvious when you cut a V-groove. Later in the video, we will explain the technique of making this and other adjustments. First, let's cut a V-groove. The groove location is a matter of aesthetics and is affected by the general size of the mat. Typically, you may decide to place it about a 1/2 inch outside the opening. For this demonstration, we will cut an 11 by 14 mat with 2 1/2 inch borders and a V-groove 2 inches from the edges of the mat. Cut the V-groove first, then the opening. Draw the pencil lines on the back at 2-inch mat border locations. Cut any 3 of the 4 sides and remove the mat. Use a permanent Scotch tape such as the 3M 810 and tape all 3 cuts from the back. Place the mat back under the clamp and cut the 4th side, then tape it also. Readjust the blade so it only cuts about 3/4 of the way through a mat. Test it on a piece of scrap to be sure. It is often hard to see the first cuts when you view them from the front. Use a soft pencil and make very light erasable lines that extend the cuts at all 4 corners. It will then be easier to see where to start and stop, and you can erase the pencil marks when you finish. Turn the mat face up and put it back in place under the clamp and against the mat guide. Insert the blade tip exactly on the previous cut. Cut to the other previous cut, and you will see a strip has been separated from the mat. Turn the mat 90 degrees and repeat the cut. When you have recut all 4 sides, if you started and stopped precisely, all 4 strips will be freed and the V-groove will have been produced. After cutting the V-groove, cut the opening in the usual way. The Matmate 40 includes a Matmate template and 5 number 3 Dexter-type blades in the parts bag. With this blade and the template, you can cut beveled circles from 1 inch to 11 inches in diameter. To cut a circle of 5 inches diameter, for example, first remove the mat cutting blade. The inside of the blade cover has 2 grooves in which to place the Dexter blade for either push or pull cutting. We will insert a blade in the groove for pushing. Mount the cutter on the template as shown. The blade will go through the slot in the template. Fasten the cutter to the template with the 2 thumb screws you used previously when you attached the riser for sizing. You want to fully penetrate the mat and slightly enter the slip sheet. There are 3 rows of holes in the template. The center row is used for pencil marking lines on a mat, which will be demonstrated later. The other 2 rows are used to place the pivot pin at the center of the circle you plan to cut. Notice the arrows near the cutter. They show the row to use with the direction of cutting. Cutting circles with the template will be done from the front of the mat, not the back. Place the pivot pin from the parts bag in the hole labeled 5 inches for pushing the cutter. Stick the pin in the mat at the location of the center of the circle you will cut. Push down on the pivot pin so it does not slip. Rotate the cutter handle to fully insert the blade and push the cutter. After cutting as far as convenient, keep the blade in the mat and turn the mat and slip sheet clockwise to continue the cut. It may require rotating the mat several times to complete the circle. When you reach the start of the circle, rotate the handle upright and remove the template, cutter, and the circular fallout. The template can also be used to draw pencil lines parallel to the edge of a mat at locations from 1/4 inch to 5 3/4 inches from the edge of a mat. This is an alternative way to make lines to be used to start and stop bevel cutting. Turn the template upside down and place it with the rib against the edge of a mat. Insert a sharp pencil in the hole in the middle row at the location where you want the line, for example, the 2-inch hole. Slowly slide the template along the mat, keeping the rib in contact with the edge of the mat. Turn the mat to the next edge and repeat. This is a handy feature when you want mat borders that are different from edge to edge, such as a weighted bottom border. It is more convenient than moving the clamp to draw lines as shown previously. Your Matmate system was adjusted at the factory prior to shipping. Under normal use, these adjustments will not change. However, you may want to check them or should at least know what they are for. The most important adjustment is called squaring. As mentioned previously, this adjustment assures the cuts will be perfectly parallel to the edge of the mat, most important for cutting V-grooves. Place the clamp at 2 inches on the base. Use a small scrap piece of mat about 8 inches square. Place the mat under the clamp near the upper end of the base. Make a short, light cut on the surface of the mat about 2 inches long and near the center of the mat. Now move the mat to the near end of the base and again place it against the mat guide. Make another light cut that starts before the first cut and runs into it. Remove the mat and bend it slightly so you can see if the 2 cuts are exactly in line. If they are, no adjustment is required. If they do not coincide, it will be necessary to loosen one of the end caps and slide it to increase or decrease the mat border. Measure the border created by each of the 2 cuts. If the lower cut is 2 inches, then adjust the upper end cap. Conversely, If the upper cut is 2 inches, adjust the lower end cap. These adjustments are made by loosening the 2 Phillips head screws that hold the end cap on the end of the base. Tap the end cap lightly to slide it in the desired direction. Retighten the 2 screws and check the results with 2 new cuts. When the clamp is placed on the base, the teeth at both ends of the clamp engage teeth in the end caps, so the clamp will be firmly retained. You will see a knurled thumb knob at both ends of the clamp. Turning either of them clockwise will tighten the fit of the clamp, and turning either of them counterclockwise will loosen the fit. Once set, these screws should not be changed for each mat, but should hold their adjustment indefinitely. There are 2 set screws in the base of the cutter which permit you to adjust the cutter so it glides smoothly on the clamp without binding. They are accessible from the front of the cutter and can be turned with the hex wrench provided in the parts bag. If it becomes necessary to make the adjustment, start with either screw and slowly tighten it while sliding the head back and forth. At the first indication of drag, loosen the screw about 1/4 turn. Then make the same adjustment with the other screw. In both cases, make the adjustment while sliding the head. Be sure not to over-tighten them. 3 Phillips head screws are seen on the back of the cutter. Their purpose is to allow the handle to pivot on the cutter without being too loose or too tight. The 2 upper ones should be fully tightened, and the lower one tightened just enough to allow the handle to pivot freely without binding. The mat guide is held to the edge of the base with 4 Phillips head screws. They should be just loose enough to allow you to push the mat guide down for sizing or pull it back up so the edge of the mat can rest against it. Avoid having it so loose that the mat guide can slip downward unexpectedly. The Fletcher-Terry Company has a variety of tools for the framer, both professional and amateur. Perhaps the most indispensable is the point driver, which inserts metal points into the wood frame to hold the glass, artwork, mat, and backing board in place. The frame master drives a stiff point, while the Flexi-master inserts a flexible metal point. Both types of points are stacked with an adhesive, which makes it easy to reload as needed. To use either point driver, firmly support the outside of the frame. Hold the nose of the point driver tightly against the frame and pull the trigger. A flexible point can be bent upward, allowing the artwork, glass, mat, and backings to be quickly removed to change the artwork. The point can then be bent back in position after making the change you wish. The depth of penetration of points is adjustable by tightening or loosening the screw at the rear of the tool. The frame mate inserts loose framing points in a frame for the same purpose as a point driver. The point is gently squeezed into the wood rather than driven by a spring. The frame mate is more appropriate for thin, delicate, or small frames. Loosen the clamping screw which holds the nose piece. Squeeze the handle and slide the nose piece to touch the inside of the frame. Tighten the screw to lock the nose piece in this position. A magnet holds the point in place. Place a point in position against the lip of the magnet. The bird edge of the framer's point should be facing down toward the backing board. Put downward pressure on the nose piece, pushing the point firmly against the backing board. Now, slowly squeeze the handles to push the point into the wood. This tool can also insert brads or push points. The push mate, pull mate, and spring mate are very handy tools. The push mate will manually push points into the frame. You can use framer's points, push points, or even diamond points. The pull mate is used to extract a framer's point. It hooks onto the notch in the point so you can pull the point out of the frame. The spring mate allows you to remove the spring clips from a metal frame. Reach under the lip of a frame and capture the spring clip in the slot of the spring mate. Twist the tool to straighten the clip and pull it out. The Matmate oval circle cutter can cut beveled circles or ovals in mat board or foam board up to 3/16 inches thick. Its capacity is circles from 4.5 inches to 21 inches diameters, or ovals as long as 24 inches. The Dexter number 3 type blade is inserted as shown and latched on the pin so it can be inserted or retracted from the mat. Be sure to handle blades very carefully to avoid being cut. To cut a 5 by 8 oval, for instance, set the 5-inch width by sliding the head of the 5-inch position on the scale beam. The length of the oval is determined by positioning the offset metal plate to the difference between the length and width, which is 3. In oval cutting, this is known as the offset. Loosen the pivot knob on top and push the offset slide out of the base until the end of the metal plate lines up with 3 on the scale, and then lock the pivot knob. Place the mat face up on the slip sheet and locate the center of the oval by making a penciled cross with lines about 5 inches long. Place the base of the cutter on the mat with the pencil lines oriented to the index marks on the sides of the base. Push the base down firmly so the pins in the bottom fully penetrate the mat. Start with the beam to the right with your left hand on the base, holding it down on the mat. Start rotating the beam clockwise with your right hand. After an inch or so, the cutter head will line up with the direction of travel. Now use your right thumb to slowly push down on the blade lever so the blade gradually enters the mat part way. After about 1/3 of a revolution, stop and reposition the mat and slip sheet in a counterclockwise direction without letting the blade come out of the mat. Now continue to rotate the cutter again as far as it is convenient to do so. It may take 3 or 4 repositionings of the mat and slip sheet to complete one revolution. After passing the starting point, push down further on the blade lever while rotating the cutter so the blade is now cutting all the way through the mat. Continue cutting and rotating the mat and slip sheet until you pass the starting point again and the fallout is fully separated. Be sure you keep the base of the cutter tightly against the mat throughout this procedure so the locating pins remain embedded in the mat. Retract the blade and lift the cutter off the mat and discard the fallout. Handle the cutter carefully because the locating pins in the bottom are sharp. Cutting a circle utilizes the same technique, except the offset is set to 0 and the width becomes the diameter of the circle. With the tools demonstrated here, you can produce impressive mats which will highlight your art or photography. Practice will increase your skills. Use your imagination as you combine ovals, rectangles, multiple mats, and V-grooves. At the same time, you will gain the satisfaction that comes from professional craftsmanship.